All right, today we're going to crack open a theological cold case. We're diving deep into an investigation that goes right to the very heart of the Christian faith, and it all spins around one single explosive question about who Jesus really was. A question that, believe me, once threatened to tear the early church completely apart.
So this is it. This is the big question that frames our entire investigation. Was Jesus the Son of God by his very nature, eternal and divine from the absolute start, or was he an exceptional human being who was later adopted by God and kind of granted a divine status? The answer, as you're about to see, changes absolutely everything.
So, to really get why this was such a massive deal, we first need to understand the other side of the argument. It's a belief called adoptionism, and it painted a radically different picture of Jesus.
So what is adoptionism exactly? Well, it basically frames divinity not as something you are, but as something you get. It teaches that Jesus was born a perfect, but still entirely human man. Then at some key moment, and people often pointed to his baptism in the Jordan River, God essentially adopted him, elevating him to the divine status of Son of God.
And this wasn't some one-off fringe idea that just popped up and went away. No way. As you can see here, it was this persistent, nagging question that just kept coming back, again and again. From Paul of Samosata way back in the 3rd century, to a huge flare-up in 8th century Spain, and even getting revived in the Middle Ages, this adoption theory just wouldn't die.
Okay, so the most famous version of this whole thing, it blew up in 8th century Spain. You had these two bishops, Elipandus and Felix, and they came up with this really complex theory they called double sonship. They were trying to have it both ways. They argued, okay, sure, in his divine nature, Christ is God's natural son, but in his human nature, he's only an adoptive son. Now, this was seen as a kind of offshoot of another heresy, Nestorianism, which was famous for sort of splitting Jesus into two separate people, one human and one divine.
And that brings us to the real heart of the case. Why wasn't this just some friendly theological squabble? Why did the early church see this as like a 5-alarm fire for the faith? It wasn't just seen as wrong, but as profoundly dangerous.
All right, let's put these two views side by side, because this is where you really see the clash. On one side, you've got the Orthodox belief. Jesus is Son by his very nature. He shares the exact same substance as the Father, and he exists as one single divine person. But on the other side, the Adoptionist view. Jesus is a son by adoption, something that happens in time. He's given a divine status. He's essentially a human person who gets joined up with the divine. These are not small differences, right? We're talking about two completely different identities for Jesus.
So let's break down the 3 big dangers here, because they were very, very real. First, it makes Jesus a created being, not the eternal God. That's a huge problem. Second, as we just saw with that double sonship idea, it logically splits Christ into 2 separate persons, a human person and a divine one, which completely destroys the belief that he is one unified person. And third, and this is the most critical one, it completely undermines the entire Christian idea of salvation. The whole point of Christian theology is that God himself became human to bridge the gap. If Jesus is just an adopted human, well, that bridge is broken.
So, faced with what they saw as this massive threat to the very core of their belief, the church's response? Well, it wasn't shy. Let's take a look at the verdict that was handed down over the centuries.
And the pattern here is just crystal clear. From way back in the late 2nd century, the verdict was heresy, guilty. Pope Victor I, the Council of Antioch, the huge landmark Council of Nicaea, and later the Council of Frankfurt, it's like every time this idea reared its head, bam, it got shot down. The church consistently came back with the same answer. Jesus is the Son of God by nature, period, not by adoption.
And if you want the final, definitive word on the matter, you've got to look at this one line. It comes from the Nicene Creed, and it's basically the theological mic drop on adoptionism. Begotten, not made. That means he wasn't created, and of the same substance. The Greek word they used was homoousios, means he is fully God in the exact same way the Father is God. There is just no wiggle room for a later adoption in that formula.
Okay, so the history books have closed on this case, right? But does any of this actually matter to us today? Let's bring our investigation into the modern world and see if we can find any echoes of this ancient idea.
I mean, it's so easy to look at these debates and just think, wow, that's a lot of ancient theological hair-splitting. But here's the thing. That core question, who exactly is Jesus, is just as alive today as it was back in the 3rd century. And ideas that look a whole lot like adoptionism have proven to be remarkably sticky. And you can actually see these echoes all over the place if you know where to look. Some early forms of Unitarianism, for instance, taught that Jesus was a human who was adopted into divinity. The theology of Jehovah's Witnesses, which denies Christ's co-eternal divinity, runs on a very similar track. And even more informally, this idea just pops up as a really common misunderstanding among some Christians who might think that Jesus became the Son of God at his baptism, rather than that moment being the big reveal of who he was all along.
Now, I want to show you one of the most powerful and, honestly, one of the most elegant counter-arguments the early church came up with. And it wasn't some long, complicated philosophical proof. Nope, it was just a simple title they gave to Mary, Jesus' mother. Theotokos.
Theotokos. It literally means God-bearer, or as it's often translated, Mother of God. And this title, it's a direct slam dunk against adoptionism. Just think about it for a second. If Mary gave birth to God, then Jesus had to have been God from the very first moment of his existence, right? He couldn't have been some mere man who got adopted or promoted down the line. By insisting on this title for Mary, the church was, at the same time, making a huge definitive statement about who her son truly is.
And that's where we land. This whole case, this ancient debate, it was never just about getting the words right. It was about protecting the very foundation of the faith. Because if Jesus isn't who that creed says he is, if he's a created being who got adopted into sonship, well then the entire structure of Christian belief about God and humanity and salvation that's built on that foundation, it starts to get real shaky. It forces us to ask, what happens to a building when you change its cornerstone?